Thank you for your prayers. For 8 weeks now, we've been reading the Gospel of Mark, and we've been looking at how the Gospels can be our spiritual GPS, how the Gospel can help us to recalculate where we're going in life and how we live our lives so that we become disciples of Jesus Christ. And so this week we're looking at an inconvenient truth. An inconvenient truth. We heard 3 things that I want to bring to our attention in today's gospel. There's lots of things there, but 3 things that I want to point out. Number 1 is Jesus last week we saw sent the disciples out 2 by 2. There were only 12 of them, so they had 16. Sent them out to preach the word and to lay hands on people and encourage them to be made whole in Jesus Christ. And the first thing I want to point out to you is they came back and Jesus said, well, how did it go? And they discussed everything with him about all that was happening and rejoiced at what they were able to accomplish in his name. The first thing we need to do in our spiritual journey is to always remember that the Lord's asking us, how's it going? And do we take the time to discuss with the Lord what's going on in our lives and what's happening in our lives? And some of us might think, well, God knows everything that's going on, and I don't need to discuss anything with him. But if we're using the Gospels as our GPS, and we're asking God to be our first coach, our primary coach, our teacher, and our, as we learned last week, our leader telling us to travel light, we need to talk about it with him. We need to talk to God about what's going on, and need to listen to how the Gospel asks us to respond in the midst of our journey, to celebrate what's going on and also to share the things that might be weighing us down. We need to have that conversation. That conversation is called prayer. And oftentimes we think prayer is just rote prayers that we memorize. But having that connection with Jesus Christ, just like the disciples did, is important. We must be doing that if Jesus Christ is going to be our coach in life. Second thing I want to point out to you is this, that each of the disciples didn't go to Jesus personally and talk. They talked about it in a group. They talked about it together. They sat down in a small group of the 12 or 13 of them, and they found out that it wasn't just happening to me, and it's not about me. These things that were happening to us. That some problems or some difficulties that others were having were their experience too. And how are you handling it? How are you doing it? How are you making it? So they were able to share wisdom with one another. In our spiritual journey, if we're traveling alone and not even including the Lord, and we're not talking to others about our faith, we're not going to make it. We're not going to make it. Because we need to have people who encourage us on the way and encourage us on the journey and help us to grow in being disciples. That is important. And then the third thing that we hear in the gospel, and I said there's many things that we hear here, but the third thing we hear in this gospel is after they shared with one another what was going on, Jesus invited them to go to a deserted place and be refreshed and renewed. Go to a deserted place to be refreshed and renewed. So he invites them to come apart. And you know, we've got all sorts of excuses not to come apart. And we're too busy to do this. We get our kids involved in tons of activities and drop them off here and there, and they don't know how to play. They don't know how to chill out. They don't know how to relax. It was interesting on Friday. Yesterday I went with Father Richard Trainer and Father Brian O'Toole into Boston to the Ted Kennedy Senate Museum. What a wonderful place that is. If you haven't been, really take the time to go. That's another story and another homily. However, going to the museum, we drove to the museum and parked in the yard there because it was free parking. But you know, if you want to go anywhere else, you got to pay to park, and sometimes it's very hard to park. So we went on the T, and we went from the UMass Columbia Point Station to Park Street so that we could go to Sam Lagrassi's sandwich shop. Another story. But anyway, so while we were on the T, now I always rode the T for the 6 years that I studied in Boston, but I was on the T and I realized how tired the T is. It's squeaking and squirming and all this stuff. But on the T was a new experience. Nobody was looking at anybody. We were the only three on the T that didn't have a smartphone. And everybody was, in their phones and everything. Nobody was talking to anybody until I got started. But you know, it's interesting because we're so busy, we don't take the time to go apart, to take the time to spend time with the Lord, and to really listen to what God has to say to us. That is incredibly important if we're going to be disciples of Jesus Christ. Now here's the inconvenient truth. Here's the inconvenient truth. There is a large gap between what we hear and read in the gospel and how we live our everyday life. There's a large gap between what we hear and see in the gospel and how we live our everyday life. One. Number two is this, that we sometimes, as Christian Catholics, just go through the motions. Go to Mass, receive the sacraments, and pray the rosary, but it's all rote and it's all just mechanical. And we don't become disciples of Jesus Christ. The third inconvenient truth is this. It is very hard to encourage people to become faithful disciples of Jesus Christ when they already think they are. It's very hard to become faithful disciples of Jesus Christ when we already think we are. And so, these 8 weeks that we've been journeying together was to point out to us the necessity of allowing the gospel to shape our responses in our everyday lives, so that the gospel aims us in the right direction. Are we using the gospel as our GPS? Amen.